The single most expensive problem in modern business,
Yeah.
and that's innovation.
Mm.
Specifically, this paradox where innovation is, it's demanded everywhere, but it's almost always treated like it's some kind of art. It's
Mm.
just random, chaotic, and totally unpredictable.
And that chaos is, it's just financially devastating. When companies launch new products or services, the failure rate is somewhere between 50 and 90%.
50 to 90, that's a huge range, but the low end is still catastrophic.
It is. And we are not talking about small misses here. We're talking about billions of dollars just wasted every single year. It's over $100 billion annually in the U.S. alone.
Wow.
All because management demands accountability and metrics in every single part of the business, except for the one process that's supposed to guarantee their future growth.
Okay, let's really unpack that failure rate because there are some classic examples that just perfectly highlight how much guessing actually costs. I mean, when we talk about technology looking for a market, my mind just immediately goes to Motorola's Iridium project in the mid-90s.
Oh, it is the perfect illustration. It's the classic case of letting the technology drive the strategy instead of, actual customer value.
It was an amazing piece of tech, though.
It was a technological marvel, no question. A huge constellation of, 66 satellites in low Earth orbit, all designed to provide global mobile communication. Motorola spent upwards of $5 billion building it.
$5 billion.
But when it finally launched, it turned out that it only appealed to this tiny, incredibly narrow demographic, high-end corporate travelers, remote government agencies, that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, because the cost was just insane. The phones themselves were like $3,000, and calls were something like $7 a minute.
Precisely. They built this world-class technology and just sort of assumed a market for it would magically appear. They completely miscalculated the rise of normal cell networks, and more importantly, they completely missed what the mass market actually measured as value.
And the result?
The result was Iridium filed for bankruptcy almost immediately after launch. It was eventually sold for just $25 million.
So a $5 billion investment for a $25 million return.
Yeah. That is about as clear a signal as you can get that your innovation process is fundamentally broken.
And just in case you think, okay, the problem is just engineers locked in a lab, the alternative, being customer-driven, that's not a silver bullet either. The failure of New Coke is a pretty terrifying counterexample.
Absolutely. New Coke wasn't a tech failure at all. It was a market research failure. And that was despite it being one of the most exhaustive, customer-driven initiatives in, ever.
They did everything by the book, right?
Yeah, everything. They conducted nearly 200,000 consumer interviews. They spent $4 million on research. They listened intently to the literal voice of the customer about what flavor they preferred.
And the launch became a national embarrassment, a total catastrophe.
Right. So it proves that both extremes can lead to failure.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, the sources we're looking at today argue that this whole cycle of randomness has to end. We're going to be diving deep into a methodology called outcome-driven innovation, or ODI.
It's a really systematic 8-step process, and it was developed specifically to transform innovation from this unpredictable art form into a predictable science.
And our mission for this deep dive is to define and then really rigorously operationalize the specific measurable criteria that customers actually use to judge value. The whole point is to make sure that every single resource, every R&D dollar, is focused only on concepts that are pretty much guaranteed to win in the market. So let's start with the central paradox that ODI is really trying to solve. We've just established that listening to the traditional literal voice of the customer is what derailed New Coke. But why? I mean, what is it about what customers say that actually messes up the innovation process?
Well, the core issue is it's that customers are actually excellent at identifying their problems. They know it's wrong, but they are just terrible at providing solutions, or, more importantly, the kind of measurable inputs that designers and engineers actually need to do their jobs.
So when companies just accept that vague input, they're basically inviting failure.
Exactly. The whole customer-driven movement fails because it asks for inputs that are inherently ambiguous. They're vague, and they end up causing the very failures that managers are trying to avoid in the first place. You have to define requirements with extreme, almost scientific precision. And our sources break down these common mistakes into 4 specific types of flawed inputs that companies collect all the time. The first one is probably the most common. Customers giving us solutions.
Right.
Customers will very often state their requirements in the form of a tangible solution that they've already thought up.
Like the razor example.
Perfect example. A user might say, I want a razor with a lubrication strip, or I need a handle with a rubber grip on it. The problem is the customer is not the technologist. They're just describing the one most obvious solution that they can imagine to fix whatever their frustration is.
So the actual desired outcome, the metric they're trying to improve, is completely hidden behind that feature request.
Yeah, completely hidden. When the customer asks for a lubrication strip, what they're really trying to measure is something like, minimize the number of nicks I get when I'm shaving. If the manufacturer just focuses on building the lubrication strip, the solution, they might miss a much more innovative opportunity.
Like a different blade design or something.
Maybe a new microvibration technology or a better blade geometry that minimizes nicks way better than any strip ever could. When you just accept solutions, you restrict creativity, you end up making Me Too products, and you often get stuck in patent gridlock.
Okay, so the second flawed input is specifications. This is where the customer gets a little more specific, but about physical things like dimensions or weight.
Yeah, we hear things like, I want a wider handle, or I want it to be lighter, or the design should have a sleek look. Again, this is dictating how to solve the problem, and it just severely limits a designer's options.
So if a customer demands a wider handle,
What they're really trying to solve for is an outcome like, prevent the razor from slipping out of my hand while I'm shaving. A wider handle is one fix, sure, but a regular-sized handle with a textured, rubberized grip might be a much cheaper, lighter, and more efficient solution. And you're completely blocked from considering that if you just accept the customer specification as a mandate.
okay, that makes sense. Then we get the third category, which is these vague, high-level needs. These are the abstract words that, they sound great in marketing copy, but they're totally useless for an R&D department. The high-level descriptions: reliable, durable, strong, effective. These words are so imprecise, and they're often open to completely contradictory interpretations. So if you go to an engineer and you say, make this product more durable,
Right. Where do they focus their millions in R&D dollars? Does durable mean increasing the life of the blade? Does it mean making the razor resist bending if you drop it? Does it mean making sure the casing can withstand constant moisture? If they guess wrong, they've just wasted a ton of resources improving a dimension the customer didn't even care about. Good input has to be precise, it has to be actionable, and most of all, it has to be measurable. And that brings us to the fourth flaw. Imprecise benefit statements. I mean, everyone wants a product that's easy to use or faster. It sounds good, but for development, it's useless. It's completely ambiguous. We saw this really clearly in a Motorola cell phone study. The researchers found over 24 different ways that customers defined easy to use.
24 different definitions.
Yeah. For one group, easy to use meant minimizing the time it takes to look up a phone number. For another group, it meant minimizing the likelihood of accidentally calling someone when the phone is in your pocket. If the designers optimize for one of those definitions, they might actually make the experience worse for the other group.
So if you don't know precisely what easy to use means, you can't reliably make it better.
You can't. Without understanding those underlying performance metrics, you're just flying blind.
So the takeaway here is pretty clear. The traditional, literal voice of the customer is actually destructive because it speaks in the language of these flawed inputs. We need to somehow filter out that noise and replace it with 3 very distinct, very specific, and highly structured inputs.
That's what the ODI methodology does. It replaces those 4 flawed inputs with 3 structured components. First, you need the job.
The job to be done.
Right. This is the fundamental core task the customer is trying to accomplish, and it's totally independent of whatever product they're using. It is the crucial unit of analysis. Are they trying to cut a piece of wood, manage their family's finances, grow corn? Focusing on the job, not the solution, lets you see competition from other industries, and it reliably defines where you can create value.
Okay, so first the job. Second, we have the outcomes, which you said are sort of the central engine of ODI.
Yes. These are the specific, measurable metrics customers use to judge how successful they are at getting that job done.
So if the job is growing corn,
the outcomes might be things like minimize the number of seeds that fail to germinate, or minimize the yield loss because of too much heat during pollination, or maybe increase the speed with which the fertilizer is absorbed by the plant. These are the tangible metrics that should be driving your design and your investment.
And the third input is constraints. These are the roadblocks, right? Physical, regulatory, whatever is preventing the job from getting done. You had a great example of this with Roche's Accu-Chek blood glucose meter.
That's a powerful example. Before 1998, all the blood glucose test kits required the user to place a very specific, precise drop of blood onto a tiny, clearly defined spot on a test strip.
Which is a huge constraint, especially for elderly users or for someone whose blood sugar is dangerously low and they really need that test to work.
Exactly. It was a huge point of failure. So Roche introduced the Accu-Chek Comfort Curve, and it completely eliminated the need for accurate blood placement. The strip just sort of drew the blood in by capillary action, making the whole process effortless.
And what was the result?
By identifying and strategically removing that one specific constraint, Roche's market share jumped from around 28% to 45% in just 2 years. It just shows you the immense value of focusing on constraints. So the entire ODI methodology really rests on 3 core tenets, and it all starts with that job focus we just talked about. But the real engine, the part that actually delivers the predictability, is the second tenet, the precision and rigor of those desired outcomes.
You mentioned before that for any given job, customers are applying dozens, maybe even hundreds of these little metrics to judge performance. How many are we really talking about?
For any given job, it doesn't matter if it's preparing a meal or performing a surgical procedure, customers collectively apply anywhere from 50 to 150 of these performance metrics.
50 to 150.
Yes. These are the customer's desired outcomes, and they're these intrinsic performance measures that are just part of executing that job. Traditional methods miss them because they only capture the things the customer is actively complaining about, which is usually just 5 or 10 outcomes.
So the key insight is that you have to satisfy all of them to get the job done perfectly.
That's the insight. Only when all 50 to 150 of those underlying metrics are well satisfied can the customer execute the job perfectly.
Okay, so to make these inputs actually useful for an R&D team, they can't just be collected in a conversation. They have to follow a really rigid, standardized format to get rid of all the ambiguity. Let's break down the anatomy of what a perfect outcome statement looks like.
The format is absolutely central. It's what transforms a subjective want into an actionable metric. So every perfect outcome statement has to have 3 specific components. First, a direction.
And this has to be either minimize or increase.
Strictly. We purposely avoid words like eliminate or prevent because those imply this absolute zero defect target that might not be realistic or even what the customer needs. If you ask a customer to rate their satisfaction on minimizing defects versus eliminating defects, that word eliminate introduces a lot of unwanted variability in the data later on.
Okay, so a direction. Second, they have to include a unit of measure.
Yes, something concrete and quantifiable. Time, frequency, likelihood, or number. It just anchors the metric in reality.
And finally, the outcome desired itself, the fundamental metric. And this has to be a measure of success, not a solution. So we go back to the razor example. Minimize the direction, the unit of measure of nicks when shaving the outcome desired. Or increase the direction of the likelihood, the unit of measure of the blade remaining sharp throughout the shaving process, the outcome desired. That's a measurable metric. That's something an engineering team can actually work with.
Exactly. It directs their efforts toward a quantifiable improvement.
To really appreciate how comprehensive this is, let's walk through the Bosch circular saw case study. The job is cutting a piece of wood, but ODI requires you to break that big job down into smaller process steps to make sure you capture all of those 50 to 150 outcomes. The process involves dissecting the job to be done into what we call a customer value model. It's basically a chronological map of the task. So for the circular saw, the main job gets broken down into steps like plan the cut, adjust the saw, start the cut, operate the saw, and so on. And there's a continuous process too, right? Like ensuring safety.
Yes, exactly. There are these overarching things like ensure safety or maintain the saw. By breaking the job into these 8 to 10 process steps, you can capture outcomes tied to each specific moment of interaction.
So can you give us a few examples from those specific steps? What does an outcome look like for, say, adjust the saw?
Sure. If we look at the adjust the saw step, that generates outcomes like minimize the time it takes to adjust the depth of the blade, or minimize the likelihood of the depth adjustment slipping after you've locked it. For the plan the cut step, you get outcomes like minimize the time it takes to measure off the width of a cut, or increase the ability to identify the precise point the blade will enter the material.
And I imagine the most critical phase, operate the saw, must have some really complex outcomes related to stability and precision.
Absolutely. That's where you find outcomes like minimize the likelihood of the cut going off track when you're approaching the end of the material and minimize the frequency with which the blade binds or jams. By systematically walking through that entire job map, the company ensures that no critical performance metric gets missed, no matter how small it seems. It gives them a complete set of measures that defines total success for the user. And this comprehensive set of metrics gives the company a huge long-term strategic advantage: stability. Because solutions change all the time, but these outcomes are timeless. That's the key strategic insight. That's it right there. Because these outcomes are fundamental measures of performance that are inherent to the job, they stay valid for years, sometimes even decades. A customer who was cleaning their teeth 50 years ago wanted to minimize the time it took to remove food from hard-to-reach places and minimize the likelihood of gum irritation.
And they want the exact same things today.
Exactly the same. The solutions change. We've gone from nylon bristles to electric sonic toothbrushes, but the outcomes, the value metrics, are stable, and this gives your R&D department a long-term fixed target to shoot for.
We should probably step back here and also acknowledge that jobs aren't just purely functional. There are critical emotional dimensions that really drive purchasing decisions.
Correct. We categorize jobs into functional jobs, that's the core task, like transporting children, and then emotional jobs.
And emotional jobs can be personal or social.
Right. Personal jobs are about how people want to feel while they're doing the job, feel successful, feel secure. And social jobs are about how people want to be perceived by others, perceived as attractive, responsible, a good parent. When you buy a high-end car, you want to transport your children, that's functional, but you also might want to feel successful, which is personal, and be perceived as a good provider, which is social. All of those dimensions add up to the final value equation. And this leads to a really important point. Breakthrough products often don't just tackle that primary functional job better, they address important ancillary jobs as well. Take the Apple iPod. Its primary functional job was, playing music. But the breakthrough came because Apple identified and successfully addressed a whole suite of previously underserved ancillary jobs that revolved around consuming music.
Like buying and storing the music?
Exactly. It allowed users to legally buy music through the iTunes Store, store and organize thousands of songs, and easily synchronize their libraries. By tackling those ancillary jobs so well, Apple created this whole ecosystem and just pulled miles ahead of competitors who were only focused on optimizing the primary job of portable audio playback.
And we see this dynamic repeating itself across different industries, especially with the growth of functional beverages.
Absolutely. Products like Sobe or Red Bull, they don't just quench your thirst. That's the primary functional job. They address ancillary jobs like improving your energy, increasing your focus, or helping you recover from exercise. These specialized drinks are now a massive part of the beverage market, and it just proves that successfully addressing these related ancillary jobs is a highly predictable path to growth once you've mapped them out. So once we understand these fundamental inputs, the jobs, the outcomes, and the constraints, the ODI process moves into strategy, and that begins with step one, formulating the innovation strategy. Before you collect a single piece of quantitative data, a company has to define who its target customer is and what kind of innovation it's going to pursue. And the sources lay out 4 different types of innovation: product service, new market, operational, and disruptive. How does a company decide where to focus? Well, it depends entirely on their current market position and what their growth objectives are. And it's a critical decision. Are you trying to improve your existing offerings? That's product service innovation. Are you trying to change the cost structure of how you deliver things? That's operational, like Dell or Walmart. Or are you trying to find new groups of customers or new problems to solve? That's new market or disruptive.
And ODI can provide the data for any of them.
It can, but you have to choose your strategy up front.
Okay, and to clarify those strategic growth options, there's a tool called the Customer Jobs Matrix. It contrasts targeting current versus new customers and current versus new jobs. Right, and that matrix gives you 3 primary paths to growth. The most common one, which represents about 80% of all initiatives, is in the lower left. Get a job done better. This is just focusing on your current customers doing their current job, and the innovation comes from addressing their most underserved outcomes, making existing products faster, safer, more convenient. Then the upper left quadrant is get more jobs done. This is the iPod strategy. You're focusing on your existing customers, but you're addressing a new or ancillary job they want to do in the same context. You're bundling more value.
And then we have the strategy of targeting non-consumers. The lower right quadrant is help new customers do a job others are already doing. This targets people or organizations who want to get a job done but are blocked, usually by high cost, a lack of skill, or just inconvenience.
The classic example of this is Canon getting into the copier market. Before them, copying was this centralized, high-cost thing that required a trained operator.
Exactly. Canon understood that the non-consumer, the small business owner, the home office user, they wanted to copy documents, but they didn't want the cost or complexity of a centralized copy center. So by targeting their specific outcomes, things like minimize the effort required to fix a jam or minimize the floor space required, Canon successfully launched the entire personal copier market. They targeted the non-consumer, they solved their specific underserved outcomes, and they created a whole new segment. Okay, so moving beyond what type of innovation to pursue, step 5 is about a strategic imperative, figuring out who in the value chain to target. Is it the end user, the purchaser, the channel partner, the OEM? This is arguably the most critical strategic decision you can make, and it's where companies make fatal mistakes all the time by focusing on the wrong customer. You have to figure out who in that value chain is making the most important value judgments about the outcomes, and then you have to go talk directly to them.
And the number one mistake here is just ignoring the end user.
Companies that are far back in the value chain, say a component manufacturer or a raw materials producer, they often rely on the OEMs or their channel partners for requirements. Take IBM's PC division in its early days. They primarily only talked to their channel partners and distributors, like Computerland.
So what kind of feedback did they get?
They got feedback related to the distributors' costs. Things like increase our margins or increase our inventory turns.
Which just forces the product to become a commodity, right?
Yeah.
You just focus on price and logistics.
Exactly. If you only listen to the channel partner, you only hear about cost metrics. You completely miss the end user's operational outcomes, which are what define the functional value. So the company starts to believe it's in a commodity market, when actually there are these huge opportunities for value improvement that only the end user knows about.
So the second mistake is not considering all relevant customers. In a complex system, like B2B or medical devices, there are often multiple people involved with different but equally important outcomes.
hmm If you're designing a network printer and you focus exclusively on the end user's printing experience, but you ignore the IT director's outcomes.
Like installation, maintenance, security.
Right. If you ignore all of that, you're making a huge mistake. The IT director might just block the adoption of your printer if their administrative outcomes are poorly satisfied, no matter how good the print quality is. You have to identify all the constituents, map their separate sets of outcomes, and then prioritize based on their combined importance.
And the third and final mistake is relying on secondhand information.
This usually means relying on your sales force for customer requirements. And salespeople, they're close to the customer, but their primary job is selling, not requirements elicitation. They will invariably report back solutions and specifications, what the customer is asking for, not the underlying measurable outcomes that actually define value.
So management takes this filtered information as gospel.
They do, and it leads them directly back to those 4 flawed inputs we talked about at the very beginning. To get accurate inputs, you need trained professional researchers to go directly to the source with the proper ODI structure. Okay, so once we have our precise, stable, and complete list of 50 to 150 outcome statements, we move to step 3. Identifying opportunities with precision. We're looking for that sweet spot. An outcome, a job, or a constraint that is both important and unsatisfied. This is where it really becomes a science. We use quantitative research. We run a statistically valid survey with a representative sample, usually between 180 to 600 people, depending on the market. And customers are asked to rate every single outcome we defined on 2 separate 5-point scales. First for importance, and second for their satisfaction with the solutions they're using right now.
And the key here is that the raw 5-point scores get converted to a 10-point scale for the algorithm. Why do you do that conversion?
The conversion to a 10-point scale just expands the range of the data. It allows the algorithm to differentiate more subtly between similar scores, and it makes the output more intuitive for management to look at. But the critical part is the calculation itself, the opportunity algorithm. That's the formula that lets us bypass all the guesswork and prioritize R&D resources based on objective customer data.
Let's review that formula again because it's so powerful. Opportunity equals importance, plus the difference between importance and satisfaction, with the crucial detail that the difference has to be 0 or more. Right? The formula is opportunity equals importance plus max of importance minus satisfaction, comma, 0. That formula ensures that the outcomes that are deemed most important and least satisfied get the highest priority score. It isolates the true value gap, Let's run through a couple of scenarios to see how that max component is so important. Scenario 1. A critical safety outcome from that Bosch circular saw example, something like minimize the likelihood of going off track when you're approaching the end of the cut. Users rate this with a high importance score, say 9.5, and a very low satisfaction score, like 3.2.
Okay, so applying the formula, you get 9.5 plus the difference, which is 9.5 minus 3.2, so 6.3. The total opportunity score is 15.8. That is an extreme opportunity. It's just screaming for immediate resource investment because the gap between what customers want and what they're getting is massive. Okay, now, scenario 2. An outcome that is important, but where current solutions are already performing really well. Let's say an outcome related to the handle grip has an importance of 9.0, but a high satisfaction of 9.2. This is where that max function comes in. The formula would be 9.0 plus the max of 9.0 minus 9.2, comma, 0. Since the difference is negative, negative 0.2, the formula treats it as 0, so the resulting opportunity score is just 9.0.
So that score, while it's still high, tells us it's a maintenance priority, not an innovation priority.
Yeah, exactly.
The low opportunity score of 9.0 signals do not invest resources in improving this further, but the high importance rating ensures it stays on your radar for quality control. You only want to target scores above 10 and preferably 12 and above for new innovation, and our sources detail some specific thresholds for interpreting these scores.
They do. Scores greater than 15 are an extreme opportunity. You rarely see those in mature markets, but they're common in new industries like medical devices or specialized software. Scores between 12 and 15 are the low-hanging fruit. They're ripe for improvement, quick wins. And anything below 10 is generally less attractive for a big resource investment because it's either unimportant or already pretty well satisfied.
This process is also critical for defining the difference between an underserved and an overserved market.
Right. Underserved markets have those high opportunity scores. They're targets for aggressive value improvement. Overserved markets are defined by outcomes where satisfaction consistently exceeds importance, usually by a lot. And these are your targets for strategic cost reduction.
And that overserved dimension, that's the real pathway to low-end disruptive innovation.
Precisely. If you find a bunch of overserved outcomes, it means you are spending money on functionality that your customers neither need nor value. You can strategically reduce the cost and function along those dimensions and create a new, lower-cost business model that your competitors who are stuck with the high-function, high-cost model just can't match.
Like that polymers producer example.
Perfect example. They kept redesigning their compounds to be stronger and more thermally resistant, which relentlessly drove up their production costs. But the original compound was already 10 times stronger than what the customer's application actually needed. The customer was being overserved and paying a premium for function they didn't need. Identifying those overserved outcomes lets you strategically take cost out without sacrificing any perceived value.
Okay, let's move to step 4, which is outcome-based segmentation, or OBS. Traditional segmentation by age, demographics, product type creates what our sources call phantom targets.
Phantom targets are useless because they group customers who might look similar on the surface, 30-year-old male, income of $75K, but who have vastly different underlying requirements and opportunity scores. OBS fixes this by using cluster analysis that focuses purely on the opportunity scores of the desired outcomes. The whole goal is to group customers based on a unique shared set of high opportunity scores. This gives R&D an actionable target.
Let's drill down into that Motorola Radio Products Group case study because it really shows how OBS can generate unique value and fight commoditization. Motorola was in a mature market, struggling with this one-size-fits-all product, and they were segmenting by vertical industry, fire, police, hospital security.
Right, but when they applied OBS, they surveyed their customers on nearly 100 functional and emotional outcomes. And the resulting cluster analysis completely ignored those traditional industry labels. It grouped customers purely based on which outcomes they found important and unsatisfied.
And the analysis revealed 3 totally distinct segments of opportunity, regardless of whether the user was a police officer or a firefighter. The 3 segments were Segment 1, privacy, which was about 40% of users. Segment 2, emergency tactical, which was 28%, and Segment 3, administrative routine, which is about 30%. And crucially, the outcomes that each segment desired were almost entirely unique, and often they were contradictory. So for Segment 1, the privacy group, what were their high opportunity outcomes?
They valued discretion and security. Their outcomes were things like minimize the effort required to communicate discreetly without drawing attention, and minimize the number of communications that can be intercepted or listened to. They didn't really care about broadcast clarity in an emergency.
And segment 2, the emergency group, must have been the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. Their high opportunity scores focused on clarity, ruggedness, and efficiency in high-stress situations. Things like minimize the number of messages that are misunderstood because of background noise, and, this was a critical one, minimize the effort required to operate the device while wearing bulky gloves. These were mission-critical gaps.
And segment 3, administrative, they just wanted smooth, routine efficiency.
Their pain points were just low-level annoyances related to daily use. Things like minimize the number of annoying, non-critical incoming communications, and minimize the effort required to program the device for routine tasks.
The power of this is that it just completely redefined their product strategy.
It did. This insight allowed Motorola to create 3 distinct optimized products instead of one compromised device. For the privacy segment, they developed features like enhanced encryption. For the emergency segment, they engineered a rugged interface that worked with gloves and added voice command. This outcome-based segmentation allowed them to compete on function and tailored value instead of being forced into a price war with commoditized products.
Finally, let's just quickly contrast OBS, which finds opportunities within an existing market, with job-based segmentation, which finds entirely new markets.
Right, job-based segmentation is what you use when you're looking for transformational growth. Microsoft, for instance, canvassed PC users not just about software features, but about all jobs they were trying to get done, many of which had no existing solution. By quantifying which of those broader jobs had the highest opportunity scores, they could identify entirely new adjacent hardware and software markets to enter. It's about mapping the whole universe of customer activity and finding the white space.
Right, now that we have the quantified list of opportunities, we know exactly which outcomes are underserved and by how much. The final 3 steps are all about execution. And step 6 is positioning current products for an immediate revenue gain just by optimizing your messaging.
This is the fastest ROI step in the whole process. A company might already have a fantastic feature that perfectly addresses a high opportunity outcome, but if the messaging is vague or it fails to connect that feature directly to what the customer measures as value, sales will just stagnate.
The messaging has to perfectly align with the customer's desired outcomes.
Perfectly. You have to move beyond just vague benefits.
Let's use the Coloplast Wound Care division as an example here. They strategically changed their communication theme based on ODI data and got immediate double-digit growth in a really mature market.
Right. The standard industry-wide message in wound care was faster healing time. Everyone said that. But Coloplast used ODI, and they discovered that, while, yeah, healing was important, 8 of the top 12 opportunities were not related to faster healing at all. They were related to preventing complications that made the wound worse.
So nurses were more concerned with other things.
They were much more concerned with outcomes like minimize the length of time the patient's skin is wet or moist around the wound, and minimize the likelihood of a healed wound breaking down again after you take the dressing off.
So Coloplast just abandoned the industry standard healing message and adopted the theme preventing complications.
That was the breakthrough. They targeted those specific high-opportunity outcomes in all their marketing materials. And within 6 months, Coloplast had double-digit growth because the new message resonated directly with what their customers were actually struggling with and measuring every single day.
So it's about connecting a specific feature to a specific underserved outcome.
Exactly.
You have to tell the customer, this unique adhesive material minimizes the length of time the skin is wet, which minimizes the likelihood of secondary complications. Be specific. What about the functional versus emotional messaging matrix? For a highly functional, complex product, how do you decide how much emotion to inject into the brand?
For highly functional, low emotional complexity products, think medical devices, enterprise software, raw materials, the focus has to be 95% on functional value. An interventional cardiologist chooses a stent based purely on its functional ability to minimize the risk of restenosis, not because it gives them a feeling of luxury.
So for those industries, you need functional perfection first.
Exactly. Companies like Apple, they introduced emotional branding to their computers, but only after they made them functionally superior. The emotion amplified the perfection. It didn't replace it. Now, conversely, low-function, high-emotion products like cosmetics or packaged goods, they rely heavily on emotion. But if your product is functionally complex and the function isn't perfected yet, functional messaging has to win, or the customer will just feel cheated.
Okay, moving past messaging. Step 7 is all about prioritizing the development pipeline. This is the mechanism for separating the winners from the losers among your current projects using something called the customer scorecard.
This is where millions of dollars are saved. Companies typically initiate dozens of projects, they spread their resources really thin, and crucially, they are extremely reluctant to kill projects that are already underway. The scorecard gives you the objective, quantitative ammunition you need to stop the waste immediately.
The Cordis Stent example really provides that link between quantified opportunity and how you allocate your resources.
Yeah, Cordis had about 40 projects in its pipeline. After they did their ODI research, they realized that the Stent initiative uniquely addressed the single most important, most underserved outcome in their market, minimizing the likelihood that a blood vessel would narrow again after angioplasty, and once they quantified that massive value gap.
The Stent project was moved from the middle of the pack to top priority. It got accelerated funding, and it allowed them to capture market leadership by being the first to market with the best functional solution. So the scorecard isn't just about finding winners. It's about estimating the precise value of a proposed solution before you even start development. How does that internal evaluation process work? It's a really rigorous internal estimation. A team of company experts, engineers, marketers, researchers, they get together and they're presented with a concept. For each targeted outcome, they estimate the satisfaction rating that this new initiative will deliver. They ask a specific question. What percentage of customers would rate this new feature a 4 or a 5, satisfied on the 5-point scale? By summing up those satisfaction scores and weighting them against the opportunity scores, the team generates a total predicted value score for the initiative. And this is the mechanism for immediately killing bad projects.
Yes. If a project is only addressing outcomes that have opportunity scores less than 10, or it's addressing outcomes that are already well satisfied, the scorecard highlights it as a low-value project. The result is you save millions by identifying and abandoning these technically interesting but commercially useless projects right away, which frees up resources for your high-opportunity concepts. And finally, step 8, devising breakthrough concepts. This is focused brainstorming to address any remaining unexploited opportunities that weren't covered by your existing products or your current pipeline. Right? Traditional brainstorming fails because the creativity is totally unfocused. People generate hundreds of ideas of questionable value because they don't know where the real opportunities are. Focused brainstorming flips that around. You only generate ideas around the underserved outcomes, the ones with scores above 12. This discipline ensures that the time you spend will result in ideas that are actually worthy of pursuit.
And the ideation follows 5 key principles, starting with staying focused on the targets.
The team has to be ruthlessly focused. If they're asked to come up with ideas to minimize drug waste in a medical pump setup, and an employee suggests increasing the container capacity, which is a solution to minimize how often you replace it, the team has to immediately recognize that that idea addresses an ancillary job, not the target outcome of minimizing waste, and they have to discard it. Focus is everything.
Second, you aim for breakthrough improvement.
The target is always ambitious. You want to aim for a 20% or more gain in satisfaction for the targeted outcome.
Right.
Incremental ideas get rejected.
Third, you constrain the thinking to enhance creativity. This sounds a little counterintuitive, but it clearly worked for Bosch. It absolutely worked because constraints force elegance. When Bosch mandated that the new circular saw solutions could not add any cost to the product, it eliminated all the expensive ideas, like a secondary vacuum system. This forced the elegant breakthrough thinking, redirecting the motor's existing airflow, which normally just cooled the engine, onto the cut path. That single cost-neutral solution addressed 2 highly underserved outcomes at the same time, clearing debris from the line and keeping dust away from the user's eyes. The 4th rule is to eliminate bad ideas quickly, and the 5th is to optimize the best idea for risk, cost, and sustainability.
Right. The objective isn't volume. It's 1 or 2 optimized, highly defensible concepts. The best idea has to achieve the desired satisfaction level, require low development effort and low technical risk, and be hard for a competitor to copy quickly.
Let's conclude with the Pratt & Whitney jet engine parts case study because it demonstrates the full predictive power of the customer scorecard in practice.
P&W's government jet engine parts division was convinced that their competitor was winning based on logistics. And they wanted to make a multi-million-dollar investment in a new shop floor logistical control system. They were hoping to boost customer satisfaction by about 10%.
But they used the customer scorecard to test that multi-million-dollar hypothesis before they committed any funds.
They did. They first quantified the value of their existing service, which was at 48.3% satisfaction, and their key competitor service, which was at 53.4%. Then the internal team evaluated the proposed logistical control system against all 85 customer outcomes. The prediction was devastating. The new system was predicted to deliver only 49.8% satisfaction, a tiny 1.5 percentage point gain. It was identified as a multi-million-dollar failure in the making.
So they killed the project, saved millions, and refocused their energy only on the high-opportunity outcomes. They found the real, underserved outcomes were all centered on information and pricing clarity. Things like minimize turnaround time on priority orders and minimize the time it took to obtain accurate order status. The logistical system did nothing for those. So instead, P&W developed a breakthrough solution, a real-time, customer-accessible tracking system combined with fixed pricing. This new, information-driven concept was evaluated and predicted to deliver 66.7% satisfaction, a massive 38% increase in value. And the real-world validation. Did it work?
1 year after they implemented it, the new solution increased customer satisfaction by 35%, which aligns almost perfectly with the model's prediction. P&W gained all their lost market share and captured an additional 5 percentage points, all because they used the scorecard to systematically direct R&D away from those technically interesting but low-value projects and towards solving important, quantified customer problems.
So this deep dive into outcome-driven innovation really shows how meticulous discipline can truly transform innovation from, a terrifying gamble into a predictable science. By focusing solely on the customer's inherent metrics, the jobs they're doing, those 50 to 150 outcomes they desire, and the constraints they face, companies can gain a unique and lasting competitive advantage.
The tactical takeaway for you, if you're a manager, is to immediately bring precision to the language of innovation inside your firm. You have to institutionalize the difference between a solution, like a rubberized handle, and an outcome, like minimizing slippage when wet. Stop listening to the metaphorical voice of the customer and start quantifying the customer's inherent performance metrics using the rigor of the opportunity algorithm.
And the beauty of this is that the knowledge you gain from this process is an invaluable long-term asset. The effort to map all 50 to 150 outcomes and calculate their opportunity scores has a shelf life that's measured in years because those underlying outcomes are so stable. That knowledge ensures that every dollar you invest in development is focused only on winning products and avoiding that $100 billion annual cost of just guessing. And finally, here's a provocative thought for you to chew on. Innovation is fundamentally dynamic because value is always migrating. When one outcome gets satisfied by a new breakthrough solution, the opportunity score for that outcome goes down, and the opportunity immediately shifts to the next important unsatisfied metric. If you, like that polymers producer, just continue to improve along dimensions that are already highly satisfied, you will eventually overserve your market. And that opens the door for a competitor to come in and seize the new, highest opportunity. The ultimate competitive strategy, therefore, isn't just to address the underserved outcomes of today, but to always be the first to anticipate and address the next underserved outcome of tomorrow.